What happens when the heir to a cotton empire loses everything that made him valuable to his cruel father? When a terrible accident strips away not just his body, but his entire identity as the future master? In 1859, on the largest plantation in Georgia, a young man's world crumbles in an instant, and his father's response will shock you to your core. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, survival, and unexpected alliances, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this tale of two souls bound by fate will leave you speechless. The morning of September 15th, 1859, dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that made even the Spanish moss hang limp from the ancient oaks of Whitmore Plantation. The air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy, as if the very atmosphere conspired to remind every living soul of their place in the rigid hierarchy that governed this corner of Georgia. 22-year-old James Whitmore III rode his stallion, Thunder, along the familiar dirt paths that carved through endless rows of cotton, the white bowls stretching toward the horizon like a sea of wealth built on human suffering. James had always been his father's pride. Tall, strong, with piercing blue eyes and the kind of commanding presence that Cornelius Whitmore believed was essential for running the largest cotton operation in all of Georgia. From childhood, James had been groomed for dominance. He could ride before he could properly walk, shoot a rifle with deadly accuracy by age 10, and command the respect of overseers twice his age by 15. A man's worth is measured by his ability to control what's his, Cornelius would say, his cold grey eyes surveying the hundreds of enslaved people who worked his land from dawn until dusk. And you, boy, will control it all one day. Every acre, every soul, every dollar that flows from this earth. The Whitmore legacy stretched back 3 generations, built on the backs of stolen Africans and their descendants. James's great-grandfather had carved the original plantation from virgin forest. His grandfather had expanded it to encompass nearly 10,000 acres, and Cornelius had transformed it into an empire that produced more cotton than any other operation between Charleston and New Orleans. The family mansion, with its towering white columns and sprawling verandas, stood as a monument to their accumulated power, a power that James had never questioned, never examined, never imagined could be anything other than his birthright. On this particular morning, James was conducting his weekly inspection of the fields, a ritual that reinforced his position as heir apparent. He observed the endless rows of enslaved workers bent under the merciless sun, their hands moving with mechanical precision as they filled their cotton sacks. To James, they were simply part of the landscape, as natural and unremarkable as the red clay beneath Thunder's hooves, or the buzzards circling overhead. He had been taught to see them as investments, as tools that required maintenance and replacement when they broke down. The concept that they might be human beings with thoughts, dreams, and souls as complex as his own had never seriously entered his consciousness. But fate has a way of humbling even the most arrogant, and it often strikes when we least expect it. The accident happened in seconds, but those seconds would replay in James's mind for the rest of his life with crystalline clarity. Thunder spooked at a cottonmouth snake coiled near the path, its dark body nearly invisible against the shadowed earth. The stallion reared violently, his powerful hindquarters lifting James high into the air before gravity claimed him. James, caught off guard while adjusting his reins and lost in thoughts about the day's cotton yields, was thrown with devastating force against the gnarled trunk of a centuries-old oak tree that had witnessed generations of Whitmore dominance. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the morning air like a gunshot, followed by screams that would haunt the plantation for weeks. James's right leg struck the massive trunk at an impossible angle. the impact so severe that several field hands working nearby heard the bone shatter from 50 yards away. Blood immediately began pooling in the red Georgia clay as James lay unconscious, his body twisted in a grotesque parody of the confident young master who had been surveying his domain moments before. When the field hands found him, led by Samuel, an elderly enslaved man whose gentle hands had delivered dozens of babies and tended countless injuries over his 60 years of bondage, James's right leg was mangled beyond recognition. The bone had not merely broken, it had been pulverized, with jagged fragments protruding through torn flesh and expensive riding pants. Samuel, despite decades of conditioning that taught him to fear touching a white man without permission, carefully lifted the unconscious heir while others ran for help, their bare feet pounding against the earth as they raced toward the big house with news that would change everything. Dr. Harrison Webb arrived from Savannah 3 hours later, his medical bag clutched in hands that had seen too much suffering in his 40 years of practice. His face grew increasingly grim as he examined the damage, probing the mangled limb while James drifted in and out of consciousness, his fevered mumblings mixing childhood memories with delirious pleas for his mother, who had died when he was 12. "The leg has to come off, Doctor," Webb announced to Cornelius, who stood rigid in the doorway of James's bedroom, like a statue carved from ice. "Infection will kill him if we don't act immediately. The damage is too extensive for any hope of saving the limb." Cornelius said nothing for a long moment, his calculating gaze moving from his son's pale, sweat-soaked face to the ruined leg that had once carried the future of the Whitmore dynasty. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no emotion whatsoever. "Do what you must," he said simply, as if discussing the amputation of a horse's leg rather than his own son's future. The amputation took place that very afternoon in James's childhood bedroom, the same room where he had dreamed of inheriting his father's empire. Dr. Webb worked with grim efficiency, while Cornelius watched from a chair in the corner, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The procedure lasted 2 hours, during which the sounds of sawing bone and James's unconscious groans created a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo through the entire plantation. When it was finished, James's right leg was gone just below the knee, wrapped in blood-stained bandages that would need changing twice daily for weeks. James awoke 2 days later to a world forever changed, his right leg gone and his future as uncertain as morning mist. But the physical loss was nothing compared to what he saw in his father's eyes when Cornelius finally visited his bedside. Disgust, disappointment, and something far worse, dismissal. The look was the same one Cornelius gave to broken tools or lame horses, a cold assessment of diminished value and lost utility. "A cripple can't run a plantation," Cornelius declared during James's first week of recovery, his voice as cold as winter wind cutting across the cotton fields. "A cripple can't command respect from overseers or fear from slaves. A cripple can't sire strong sons to carry on the family name. A cripple is useless." The words cut deeper than any surgeon's blade, severing not just James's sense of identity, but his entire understanding of his place in the world. He had been raised to believe that his worth came from his strength, his ability to dominate others, his capacity to continue the Whitmore legacy. Without his leg, without his physical completeness, what was he? For weeks, James remained confined to his room, tended by Mary, a young enslaved woman who brought his meals and changed his bandages with quiet efficiency. She was perhaps 18, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than she revealed, and hands that moved with surprising gentleness as she cared for his wounds. Through his window, James watched the plantation continue its brutal rhythm. Overseers cracking whips over bent backs, field hands laboring under the merciless sun, Children as young as 8 picking cotton until their small fingers bled and their backs ached with premature age. It was a world he'd been raised to inherit, a system he'd never questioned, but now he was nothing more than a burden, a broken piece in a machine that had no use for weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plantation yard as James made his way toward the slave quarters, his crude wooden crutches digging into the packed earth with each labored step. The crutches, hastily carved by the plantation's blacksmith from rough oak, chafed against his underarms and made every movement an exercise in pain and humiliation. Behind him, Thomas, a young enslaved man with shoulders broadened by years of fieldwork, carried a single trunk containing James's few remaining possessions. His father had stripped him of everything else, including his fine clothes, his books, his horse, and even his childhood mementos. The quarters consisted of a dozen wooden cabins, arranged in 2 neat rows, each housing multiple families in cramped, sweltering conditions that James had never bothered to imagine. The structures were built from rough-hewn pine, with gaps between the boards that offered little protection from Georgia's brutal summers or its surprisingly cold winters. Smoke rose from several chimneys, carrying the sense of cooking food that bore no resemblance to the elaborate meals James had enjoyed in the big house. Children played in the dusty spaces between cabins, their laughter a stark contrast to the gravity of the moment, while adults watched his approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. As James approached, conversations died like snuffed candles, and eyes followed his movement with the wariness of prey, animals observing a predator. These were people who had learned to read the moods and intentions of white men as a matter of survival, and James's presence among them represented something unprecedented and potentially dangerous. Some of the older residents remembered when James was a boy, racing through these same paths on his pony while they stepped aside and lowered their eyes. Now he came to them broken, discarded, and dependent, a reversal of fortune that challenged everything they thought they understood about the natural order. At the far end of the row stood a cabin slightly larger than the others, Zara's domain. The structure itself was unremarkable, but the small garden beside it bloomed with vegetables and herbs that spoke of knowledge and care. Wind chimes made from polished shells hung from the eaves, creating soft music that seemed to welcome visitors while simultaneously warning them that this was a place of power. She emerged before he reached her door, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. Zara was not what he'd expected, though he realized he'd never actually formed a clear picture of what the fiercest slave woman might look like. She was tall and powerfully built, standing nearly 6 feet in height, with skin the color of polished mahogany that seemed to glow with an inner light. Her presence filled the doorway like a force of nature, commanding attention without effort, radiating an authority that had nothing to do with legal ownership or social position. Her hair was wrapped in a colorful head wrap that spoke of African traditions maintained despite decades of attempted cultural destruction, and she wore a simple but clean dress that somehow looked regal on her imposing frame. But it was her eyes that truly struck him, dark, intelligent, and completely unafraid. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the worst humanity could offer and had somehow emerged with her soul intact. When she looked at James, he felt as if she could see straight through to his core, past his privileged upbringing and inherited prejudices to something more fundamental. "So," she said, her voice deep and measured, carrying traces of an accent that spoke of origins far from Georgia's red clay, "the young master comes to live among the people he used to own." Her words were carefully chosen, each one weighted with meaning that extended far beyond their surface content. James struggled to find words, his mouth suddenly dry despite the humid air. My father said you would. Your father said many things," Zara interrupted, beginning to circle him slowly like a predator evaluating prey. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, and James found himself turning awkwardly on his crutches to keep her in sight. He said you were broken. He said you were useless. He said I should fix you. She stopped directly in front of him, her dark eyes boring into his with an intensity that made him want to look away. What he didn't say was whether you wanted to be fixed. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Around them, other enslaved people had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces revealing a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. James could feel their attention like a physical weight, and he realized that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but potentially theirs as well. "I don't understand," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara's laugh was sharp and humorless, but not entirely unkind. "Of course you don't. You've lived 22 years in that big house, playing master to people you never bothered to see as human. You've given orders without thinking about who would carry them out, enjoyed luxuries without considering who provided them, planned a future without wondering about the people whose labor would make it possible. Now you want understanding." She gestured toward her cabin with a movement that somehow managed to be both invitation and command. "Inside, we have things to discuss." The interior of Zara's cabin was a revelation that challenged every assumption James had made about the lives of enslaved people. Despite the cramped quarters, the entire space was smaller than his former bedroom's sitting area. Everything was meticulously organized with an attention to detail that spoke of pride and intelligence. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, filling the air with scents both familiar and exotic. Books, actual books, sat on a makeshift shelf constructed from scrap lumber, their worn spines suggesting frequent use. The walls were decorated with intricate patterns that had been carved into the wood and filled with natural pigments, creating artwork that spoke of cultural memory and artistic skill that had survived the Middle Passage. "You can read," James said, unable to hide his surprise. "I can do many things your kind never imagined," Zara replied, settling into a chair that had been carefully crafted from available materials. The furniture was simple but well made, suggesting skills that extended far beyond field work. "I was educated before I was stolen. I was a teacher's daughter in my village, responsible for instructing children in mathematics, history, and 3 different languages. I spoke Yoruba, Arabic, and Portuguese before I learned English from the whip and the overseer's shouted commands." The casual mention of her past hit James like a physical blow. He'd never considered that the people his family owned had lives, dreams, and identities before their enslavement. In his mind, they had simply always existed as they were, property to be bought, sold, and used as needed. The idea that Zara had once been a teacher, that she had possessed knowledge and status and freedom, challenged everything he'd been taught about the natural order of things. "Why did my father choose you?" he asked, settling awkwardly onto a wooden stool that had been positioned across from her chair. Zara's smile was predatory, revealing teeth that were remarkably white and straight. "Because he thinks putting you with the fiercest slave woman will either break you completely or teach you your place. He doesn't care which outcome occurs, as long as you're no longer his problem." She leaned forward, her intense gaze never wavering. "But what your father doesn't understand is that I have my own plans for you." "What kind of plans?" "That depends," Zara said, standing and moving to her small window. Outside, field hands were beginning their daily march to the cotton fields, a procession that had repeated itself every morning for decades. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, knowing they would spend the day in the plantation's nursery while their parents labored under the sun. Men walked with the careful dignity of those who refused to be completely broken, their backs straight, despite the weight of oppression. Tell me, James Whitmore, what do you see when you look at my people? James followed her gaze, and for the first time in his life, he really looked. He saw Samuel, the man who'd saved his life after the accident, gently helping an elderly woman down the cabin steps, with a tenderness that spoke of deep respect for age and wisdom. He saw Ruth, a young mother whose beauty had not been diminished by years of hard labor, braiding her daughter's hair with infinite care, despite the exhaustion that lined her face. He saw Moses, a powerful man whose back bore the raised scars of countless whippings, teaching a group of children to carve wooden toys with hands that could have easily crushed their oppressors. I see. James paused, struggling with words that had never existed in his vocabulary. The concepts he was grappling with had no place in the worldview he'd inherited from his father and grandfather. I see people. Good, Zara said quietly. And for the first time, her voice carried a note of approval. That's a start. Over the following days, James began to understand the complex society that existed within the quarters. There were unspoken hierarchies based on respect rather than fear, systems of mutual support that ensured no one went hungry if food was available, and a culture rich with music, storytelling, and spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and centuries of attempted destruction. He learned that Samuel was not just an old field hand, but a keeper of oral history who could recite the genealogies of dozens of families. Ruth was not just a pretty young woman, but a skilled healer who knew which plants could ease pain and which could prevent pregnancy. Moses was not just a strong back for heavy labor, but a leader who settled disputes and maintained order through wisdom rather than violence. Zara assigned him simple tasks that gradually revealed the depth of his ignorance. He helped Aunt Celia tend her small vegetable garden, learning that successful cultivation required knowledge of soil conditions, weather patterns, and plant relationships that he'd never imagined. He assisted Benjamin with repairs to the cabin roofs, discovering that construction required skills in carpentry, engineering, and resource management that challenged his assumptions about the intelligence of enslaved people. He learned to weave baskets from Zara, whose arthritic hands moved with surprising grace as she transformed simple materials into objects of both beauty and utility. Each task was a lesson in humility that cut deeper than his physical disability. James, who had never worked with his hands for anything more demanding than holding reins or a rifle, struggled with even the simplest activities. His crutches made movement difficult, and his soft hands blistered within hours of beginning any manual labor. But slowly, something began to change in his understanding of what constituted real strength and genuine value. 3 months into his new life, James had developed calluses on his hands and a deeper understanding of the brutal realities that sustained his family's wealth. The transformation was not merely physical. Though his arms had grown stronger from constant use of the crutches, and his remaining leg had developed the muscle tone of someone who worked for survival rather than leisure. More profound was the change in his perception, the gradual dismantling of assumptions that had shaped his entire worldview. He'd witnessed Mr. Patterson whip a field hand named Jacob for working too slowly, though James now understood that Jacob was actually suffering from a fever that would have sent any white man to bed for a week. He'd seen children separated from their mothers at the auction block when Cornelius decided to liquidate some assets to pay gambling debts, watching families torn apart with the same casual indifference his father showed when selling livestock. He'd watched Zara comfort grieving families with a strength that seemed infinite, offering words of hope and practical assistance that kept the community from falling into despair. But it was the night of December 3rd that everything changed forever. when the fragile peace of the quarters was shattered by an event that would test every lesson James had learned about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of humanity. James was helping old Pete repair a broken wagon wheel when they heard the commotion from the big house. The sound carried across the plantation like thunder, shouting voices filled with rage, the crash of breaking glass, and then, most chilling of all, Cornelius's roar of fury echoing across the fields with a violence that made even the evening birds fall silent. "What's happening?" James asked, but Pete's weathered face had gone ashen, his hands trembling as he set down his tools. "Trouble," the old man whispered, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had survived 6 decades of slavery by learning to read the signs of approaching danger. "Bad trouble, the kind that gets people killed." Within minutes, Mr. Patterson and 3 other overseers came storming into the quarters like avenging angels, their faces twisted with fury and their hands resting on the whips and pistols that were the tools of their trade. Behind them walked Cornelius himself, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden steps with the rhythm of a funeral march as he surveyed the assembled enslaved people like a general reviewing troops before a massacre. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension as families emerged from their cabins, parents instinctively pulling children closer while trying to maintain the appearance of calm submission that might be their only protection. James felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he recognized the expression on his father's face. It was the same cold fury he'd shown when dealing with runaway slaves or rebellious overseers, a rage that promised swift and terrible retribution. "Someone," Cornelius announced, his voice deadly quiet in a way that was far more terrifying than shouting, "has been teaching slaves to read." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Teaching enslaved people to read was not just forbidden by plantation rules. It was a crime punishable by severe punishment under Georgia law, and everyone present knew that severe punishment often meant death. The literacy of enslaved people was seen as a direct threat to the entire system of control, a dangerous weapon that could inspire rebellion and undermine the carefully constructed mythology that justified human bondage. "We found books," Patterson added, holding up a worn copy of the Bible and what looked like a children's primer, their innocent appearance belying the explosive danger they represented. "Hidden in the quarters, someone's been running a school, teaching these animals to think they're as good as white folks." James felt his blood turn to ice as recognition flooded through him. He'd seen those books before, in Zara's cabin, carefully hidden beneath loose floorboards, but occasionally brought out for the secret lessons she conducted. But more than that, he'd seen her teaching. Late at night, when she thought no one was watching, Zara would gather small groups of children and adults in different locations around the quarters, showing them letters, helping them sound out words, opening doorways to knowledge that their oppressors desperately wanted to keep closed. The teaching sessions were marvels of organization and secrecy. Zara would post lookouts to watch for overseers, use hand signals to communicate danger, and disperse groups at the first sign of trouble. She taught not just reading, but mathematics, history, and geography, sharing knowledge that transformed her students' understanding of the world beyond the plantation's boundaries. James had watched children's faces light up with wonder as they realized that marks on paper could represent ideas, that they could preserve thoughts and communicate across distances through the magic of written language. "Now," Cornelius continued, his grey eyes scanning the crowd with the patience of a predator selecting prey, "I'm going to ask once. Who's responsible?" Silence stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap. James could see the fear in people's faces, the terror of parents who knew their children might be sold away as punishment, the desperation of individuals who understood that admitting knowledge of the school could mean death. But he also saw something else, something that filled him with a mixture of admiration and dread, a protective solidarity that ran deeper than terror, a collective decision to shield Zara even at the cost of their own lives. The community had made its choice without words or discussion. They would not betray the woman who had given them hope, who had shown them that they were capable of learning and growing and becoming more than their oppressors believed possible. It was an act of defiance that transcended individual survival, a declaration that some things were worth dying for. "No one wants to speak." Cornelius's smile was cruel, the expression of a man who enjoyed the power to inflict suffering. "Fine. Patterson, start with the children. Sometimes a little motivation helps loosen tongues." The threat was not idle. James knew his father's methods, had heard stories of children whipped until their parents confessed to crimes, both real and imagined. The thought of those small hands he'd watched learning to form letters being subjected to the lash filled him with a rage that burned away his fear. "No!" The word exploded from James before he could stop himself, his voice carrying across the quarters with surprising force. Every head turned toward him, including his father's, and he felt the weight of their attention, like a physical pressure. "Excuse me." Cornelius's voice was dangerously soft, the tone he used when his anger had moved beyond shouting into something far more deadly. James struggled to his feet, his crutches scraping against the wooden porch as he fought to maintain his balance. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear his own thoughts, but something inside him, something that had been growing during his months in the quarters, refused to let him stay silent. The faces around him, people who had become more real to him than anyone in the big house had ever been, gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. "I said no," James repeated, his voice stronger now, carrying the authority of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. "You won't touch the children." Cornelius stared at his son as if seeing a stranger, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process this unprecedented defiance. "You forget yourself, boy. You have no authority here. You're nothing but a crippled burden, a broken tool that serves no purpose. You dare to give me orders?" "I'm your son," James interrupted, and for the first time in months he stood as tall as his crutches would allow, drawing on reserves of courage he'd discovered in the most unlikely place. "And I won't let you hurt innocent people for the crime of wanting to learn." The confrontation that followed would be talked about in whispers for generations, passed down through oral tradition as the night when the master's son chose humanity over heritage. Father and son faced each other across a divide that had nothing to do with the physical distance between them and everything to do with the fundamental question of what it meant to be human in a world built on the denial of humanity to others. "You want to protect them?" Cornelius asked, his voice dripping with contempt and something that might have been disappointment. "Fine, then you can share their punishment." Before anyone could react, Patterson stepped forward with a whip in his hand, the leather strips gleaming in the torchlight like instruments of damnation. But as he raised his arm to strike, something extraordinary happened that would change the course of everything that followed. Zara moved. She didn't run or shout or make any dramatic gesture. She simply stepped between Patterson and James, her presence so commanding that the overseer actually hesitated, his arm frozen in mid-swing. There was something in her bearing, a dignity that transcended the artificial hierarchies of slavery, an authority that came from within rather than from legal documents or social position, that gave even armed men pause. "The boy had nothing to do with the teaching," she said calmly, her voice carrying across the quarters with perfect clarity. "That was my doing." "Zara, no," James started, but she silenced him with a look that contained volumes of meaning. "I taught them to read," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, as if the act of confession was liberating rather than damning. "I gave them books. I opened their minds to possibilities beyond these fields. I showed them that they are human beings capable of learning and growing and becoming more than you ever imagined possible. And I'm not sorry. The admission hung in the air like a challenge to the entire system of oppression that governed their lives. Cornelius studied her with the cold calculation of a man evaluating livestock, but there was something else in his expression, a grudging recognition of an opponent worthy of his attention. "You admit to breaking the law?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of a judge pronouncing sentence. "I admit to being human," Zara replied, her words cutting through the night air like a blade, "something you seem to have forgotten how to do." For 3 days, Zara remained locked in the root cellar, a cramped, airless space beneath the plantation's main storage building that had been designed to preserve vegetables, but now served as a tomb for the living. The cellar was barely 6 feet square and less than 5 feet high, forcing its occupant to remain in a constant crouch. No light penetrated the thick wooden door, and the air grew stale and oppressive within hours. Water seeped through the earthen walls during the frequent winter rains, creating a damp chill that penetrated to the bone. James could barely eat, knowing she was suffering while he remained free to move about the quarters. The knowledge that Zara was enduring such conditions because she had protected him and the community filled him with a guilt that gnawed at his conscience like a physical pain. He tried repeatedly to convince his father to release her, approaching Cornelius in his study on the veranda, even following him to the stables where he conducted business with visiting cotton buyers. "She'll break," Cornelius told James coldly during one such encounter, not bothering to look up from the ledger where he was recording the day's cotton weights. "They always do. Pride is a luxury that slaves can't afford, and when she finally understands that, order will be restored." But Cornelius had fundamentally underestimated both Zara's strength and the impact her imprisonment was having on the plantation community. Work slowed to a crawl as field hands moved with deliberate sluggishness, their usual efficiency replaced by a passive resistance that was impossible to punish without destroying the entire labor force. Tools mysteriously broke at crucial moments, requiring time-consuming repairs that delayed essential tasks. Small acts of defiance multiplied like sparks in dry grass. Overseers found their saddles cut, their food spoiled, their authority undermined by 1,000 tiny rebellions that were individually insignificant but collectively devastating. The quarters themselves had taken on the atmosphere of a community in mourning. The evening songs that usually filled the air with spiritual comfort had been replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by whispered prayers and muffled sobs. Children who had been learning to read under Zara's guidance sat listlessly outside their cabins, their eyes reflecting a loss of hope that was heartbreaking to witness. Samuel organized prayer circles that met throughout the day, their voices rising in spirituals that carried coded messages of resistance and solidarity. Ruth distributed extra food to families whose breadwinners had been assigned additional punishment duties, ensuring that no one went hungry despite the increased hardships. On the 4th morning, as dawn painted the sky in shades of grey and pink that reminded James of his mother's watercolor paintings, he made a decision that would change everything. The choice came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as the inevitable conclusion of months of gradual awakening, the final step in a transformation that had begun the moment he'd been cast out of his father's house. He found the key to the root cellar in his father's study, the same room where he'd been disowned months earlier, where family portraits looked down from the walls with expressions of disapproval that seemed to follow his movement. The key hung on a ring with dozens of others, each one representing some aspect of Cornelius's absolute control over the plantation and everyone on it. James's hands shook as he selected the right key, knowing that this act of theft would mark him as irredeemably beyond his father's forgiveness. The lock turned with a click that seemed to echo through the pre-dawn silence like a gunshot. James pulled open the heavy wooden door, not knowing what he would find in the darkness below. Zara emerged, blinking into the dawn light, her powerful frame weakened by 3 days without food or water, but her spirit unbroken. Her clothes were soiled and torn, her hair had escaped its usual careful arrangement, and her skin bore the marks of her confinement. But her eyes, those remarkable eyes that had first captured James's attention, still burned with the same fierce intelligence and uncompromising dignity that had made her a leader among her people. Her first words were not about her own suffering, but about the others. "The children," she whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst, but still carrying the authority that had made her a natural teacher. "Are they safe?" "They're safe," James assured her, supporting her weight as she struggled to stand on legs weakened by confinement. "But Zara, we can't stay here. Your father will do what he's always done," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word as circulation returned to her cramped limbs. "He'll try to break what he can't control. But James—" She gripped his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his flesh with an urgency that spoke of desperate hope. "Some things can't be broken. Some things only grow stronger under pressure." Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen that would transform not just their individual lives, but the entire dynamic of the plantation community. James and Zara, working together despite the enormous risks, started to build something that had never existed on Whitmore Plantation, a network of quiet resistance that operated beneath the surface of daily routine like an underground river flowing toward freedom. It began small, with acts of kindness and protection that seemed insignificant but carried profound meaning for those who benefited from them. James used his knowledge of the plantation's operations, gained from years of preparation to inherit the estate, to help people avoid the worst punishments. He warned Samuel when Patterson was planning a surprise inspection of his cabin, allowing the old man to hide the carved wooden figures he made for the children, objects that could be seen as evidence of uppity behavior. He helped Ruth hide her son David when Cornelius decided the 12-year-old boy was old enough for full-time field work, buying the family precious weeks before the inevitable separation. He shared information about which overseers could be reasoned with and which were beyond redemption, knowledge that could mean the difference between a warning and a whipping. Zara, meanwhile, continued her teaching in secret, moving the lessons to different locations each night and developing an elaborate system of signals and codes that allowed the school to operate under the noses of the overseers. The root cellar experience had only strengthened her resolve, transforming her from a teacher into something approaching a revolutionary. "They can imprison my body," she told her students during a clandestine lesson held in the depths of the cotton storage barn, "but they cannot imprison my mind, and what I put in your minds, they can never take away." The curriculum expanded beyond basic literacy to include mathematics, geography, and history, subjects that opened new worlds to people who had been told they were incapable of learning. Moses learned to calculate compound interest and began to understand how debt was used as a tool of oppression. Sarah studied maps and realized for the first time the true size of the world beyond Georgia's borders. The children absorbed knowledge with a hunger that amazed even Zara, their young minds proving capable of grasping concepts that challenged their teachers' assumptions about human potential. But their greatest achievement was something neither had planned. They began to see each other not as master and slave, not as oppressor and victim, but as partners in something larger than themselves. The relationship that developed between them transcended the artificial boundaries of race and class, creating a bond based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a growing understanding that their fates were inextricably linked. "You've changed," Zara observed one evening as they sat by the small fire outside her cabin, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces, while around them the quarters hummed with quiet activity. People shared food despite their own hunger, told stories that preserved cultural memory, and planned for a tomorrow that might bring freedom or might bring death. "So have you," James replied, studying her profile in the firelight. "You're different than when I first arrived." Zara smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, the expression reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "I'm not different. I'm just more myself. Having someone who sees me as human instead of property, it changes how I see myself." "Is that what we are?" James asked, the question carrying weight that extended far beyond its simple words. "Partners." "We're something your father never imagined," Zara said, her voice carrying a note of wonder as if she were discovering the truth, even as she spoke it. "We're proof that his system doesn't work, that people can choose to be better than the circumstances that created them." Their partnership was tested in ways neither could have anticipated, each challenge strengthening their bond while revealing new depths of courage and commitment. When Moses was caught trying to escape and faced a brutal whipping that could easily prove fatal, James intervened by claiming the man was acting on his orders to scout new cotton fields. The lie was transparent, but it provided enough confusion to reduce the punishment from 50 lashes to 20. When a group of slave catchers arrived looking for runaways from a neighboring plantation, Zara used her network to hide them in the swamps until the danger passed, coordinating a rescue operation that involved dozens of people and required split-second timing. But the greatest test came in the spring of 1860, when Cornelius announced his intention to sell half the plantation's enslaved population to pay mounting debts accumulated through gambling and poor investments. The news spread through the quarters like wildfire, bringing with it a despair that threatened to destroy everything James and Zara had built. "Families will be separated," James told Zara after overhearing his father's plans during a meeting with slave traders from New Orleans. "Children torn from mothers, husbands from wives. Everything we've worked for will be destroyed." "What do you suggest?" Zara asked, though her eyes already held the glint of an idea that was both audacious and terrifying. "We run," James said simply, the words carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything, all of us together. It was an audacious plan, perhaps impossible. 43 people, including children and elderly individuals, attempting to escape together through hostile territory where every white face was a potential enemy and every road led to capture or death. But as they began to organize, something beautiful emerged from the network they'd built over months of small resistances. Samuel used his knowledge of the local waterways, gained from decades of fishing expeditions, to map escape routes that avoided main roads and populated areas. Ruth organized supplies and identified safe houses along the Underground Railroad, using connections established through her work as a seamstress for wealthy families in nearby towns. Moses recruited allies from neighboring plantations, building a communication network that could coordinate simultaneous escapes and provide mutual support. Even old Pete, despite his advanced age and failing health, contributed by creating false documents that might help them pass as free people traveling north for work. The night they chose for the escape was moonless and cloudy, perfect for moving unseen through the Georgia countryside. 43 people gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying nothing but hope, determination, and the knowledge that failure would mean death or a fate worse than death. As they prepared to leave, moving like shadows through the familiar paths of the plantation, Cornelius appeared with a group of armed overseers, having discovered their plan through a spy among the house servants. The confrontation that followed would become legend, passed down through generations as the night when ordinary people chose freedom over safety and changed the course of history. "Going somewhere?" Cornelius asked, his voice deadly calm as he surveyed the assembled group with the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. The final confrontation between father and son, between the old order and the new, between oppression and liberation, would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of everyone who had dared to dream of freedom. In that moment, standing between his father's guns and the people who had become his true family, James understood that some choices define not just who we are, but who we choose to become. Years later, after the Civil War had torn the country apart and rebuilt it on new foundations, stories would emerge about a strange partnership that had flourished in the darkest days of slavery. The tales grew in the telling, becoming legend, but at their heart lay a truth more powerful than fiction. People spoke of a white man who had given up his inheritance to fight alongside the enslaved. They told tales of a black woman whose strength and wisdom had inspired an entire community to believe in freedom. Some said they had died in the war, fighting with Union forces. Others claimed they had founded a school for freed slaves in the North. Still others insisted they had traveled west, helping to establish communities where former slaves could build new lives. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of the legends. James and Zara had indeed escaped that night in 1860, leading their community through swamps and forests to freedom. They had made their way north, where they worked with the Underground Railroad, helping other families find liberation. When the war came, they served as guides and spies, using their knowledge of plantation life to aid Union forces. After the war, they returned to Georgia, not to Whitmore Plantation, which had been burned during Sherman's march, but to the small town that had grown up around it. There, they established a school that welcomed children of all races, teaching them not just reading and writing, but the harder lessons of justice, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what's right. They never married. The laws and customs of their time made such a union impossible, but they remained partners in every way that mattered. James never fully recovered the use of his leg, but he learned that true strength had nothing to do with physical perfection. Zara never forgot the years she spent in chains, but she transformed that pain into a fierce determination to ensure no child would grow up believing they were less than human. When James died in 1889, Zara spoke at his funeral to a crowd that included former slaves, Union veterans, and even a few former Confederate soldiers who had come to respect the man who had chosen conscience over comfort. "He was not born good," she said, her voice still strong despite her 70 years. Goodness was something he chose, day by day, decision by decision. He proved that people can change, that even those born into systems of oppression can choose to become agents of liberation. When Zara passed 5 years later, the school they had built together was renamed in both their honors. Above the entrance, carved in stone, were the words that had become their shared motto: "Their fates rise because some things are worth fighting for." The plantation system that had once seemed eternal crumbled into history, but the lessons learned in those quarters, the bonds forged between two unlikely allies, and the proof that human beings can choose to be better than their circumstances, those things endured. And in a small town in Georgia, children of all colors continued to learn that the most powerful force in the world is not wealth or violence or the accident of birth, but the simple, revolutionary act of seeing each other as fully, completely, magnificently human. This story proves that even in the darkest times, unexpected alliances can spark revolutionary change. James and Zara's journey from master and slave to partners in liberation shows us that transformation is always possible. but it requires the courage to see beyond the systems that divide us. If this story moved you, smash that like button. Subscribe for more incredible historical tales, and let me know in the comments what unlikely partnership in your own life has taught you the most about courage and change. Your story might inspire our next video. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how ordinary people can make extraordinary choices that change the world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep believing in the power of human connection to overcome even the most impossible odds.